75 years ago this week, Europe ended its darkest chapter in history with the liberation of the Nazi concentration camp of Auschwitz-Birkenau, which saw the systemic murder of 6 million Jews and many other minorities under Hitler. I was fortunate enough to interview Holocaust survivor Manfred Goldberg, and he issued to me a warning about resurgent anti-Semitism in modern times, and would be foolhardy if we did not heed it. Anti-Semitism is the one ring of racism to unite all extremes. Far left, far right, and Islamist extremists all hate each other, but the one thing they agree on is their hatred for Jews. The modern manifestation of this ancient hatred, defeated as it was, knows it cannot attack out in the open and so shrouds itself in euphemisms. But Britain is the nation that stood strong against Jew hate during our darkest hour. Now, just as then, we shall not be fooled. If never again is to mean anything at all, it is to call out this evil before we all sleepwalk towards it again. So let me be clear. Cloaking your anti-Semitism in the name of anti-Zionism will no longer cut it. Anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism.
Majid, I'm reminded that you and I have spoken, of course, at events for CST, which is the organisation. Before I move forward, one of the most fascinating aspects that came out of some of the most powerful documentaries I've seen that we witnessed was the narrative that's emerging now that any of the material that was photographed by the Nazis, should we actually be showing that now? Because that is through their lens. That is how they wanted to see Jewish people portrayed as almost, pardon me, almost like vermin being rounded into ghettos with the children coming up. And by continuing to play that, are we actually allowing that? Yeah, we're actually allowing the Nazi perspective. Now, post-liberation, where you see the bodies being treated effectively as piles of rubbish, again, in some instances, those could be people's grandparents, that they're seeing their faces contorted and twisted and the numbers. There are so many aspects. But to your central point, I don't need to remind you, because I know you're close to it. It was just around Christmas or Hanukkah time that the parts of North London had some graffiti. Yeah. We've seen terrible attacks in the United States recently and in France. You are regrettably, Majid, you are absolutely and wholly right. This is something that needs to be combated, and I have to point to, we touched on this briefly, the general election. You sort of touched on it in an earlier conversation. Sadly, there are issues within the Labour Party, which they are seeking to address, but if in any way that is seen to legitimise this vile sense of racism, which I think through some it might, that is something that needs to be addressed very, very urgently.
I think you're wrong in this sense, because I've watched a few documentaries this week, and the horror of what you say. I think we need to be reminded of that so that people know what that is, because young people today, a lot of them don't have any idea about the Holocaust or what happened there. But there is still this deeply embedded hostility towards Jews as a race, and we see it. It's on the march. You're saying let's not happen again. It's happening. It's happening in France. 74% rise in anti-Semitic attacks in France. In Germany, more than a 60% rise. In this country, we see that the Labour Party is infused with anti-Semitism, and we talk about it. And what worries me in this country is we talk about it. We say how terrible it is. We say how awful it is, and it mustn't be allowed to happen. And yet we tolerate it, and in tolerating it, we allow it to flourish.
I've got a statistic for the perception of anti-Semitism being on the rise.
Let me just see the Labour Party. We need to say, because we mentioned 2 or 3 times, so let me just, and I'll come straight to the Labour Party says the following: we are taking decisive and robust action to root out the small minority in our party who have engaged in anti-Semitism, and we are raising awareness about anti-Semitic stereotypes and conspiracy theories to enable more people to challenge and call them out.
Yes, in perception of anti-Semitism across the EU in 2018, 89% thought that anti-Semitism had increased in the last 5 years. I mean, I think you moved us onto a slightly different area when you said that anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism should be exactly synonymous. I think that there are difficulties with that when you've seen the Trump peace plan, which completely excludes, Palestinians from Jerusalem. You can understand why.
Well, they go to East Jerusalem.
I stand corrected.
That's all right.
You can understand why there still has to be a conversation about the role of Israel. But can we segregate that from
just to clarify, because to clarify clarify Zionism, and I think this is where there's a common misunderstanding, especially in British political parlance. It's important to clarify that when people, especially Jews, when they use the word Zionism, they simply mean the Jewish right to a homeland. That's very different to, for example, the detailed conversations as to whether East Jerusalem should be a capital of Palestine. And so criticize Netanyahu, criticize Netanyahu, criticize policies of the Israeli government. But like Britain and America, I believe wrongfully invaded Iraq. That doesn't mean I now suddenly say America doesn't have the right to exist, Britain doesn't have the right to exist. Zionism is simply that. It's the right for the Jewish people to have a homeland.
And unfortunately, the conflation of the two actually helps anti-Semitism because it muddies the water. One thing that always is a problem in this debate is in this conversation is the idea that the moment you mention what happened in the 1930s and 40s, you're saying that this person or this movement is exactly the same, and therefore everyone, anytime you mention that, you get accused of Godwin's law, you get accused of exaggerating. The whole point of history is to learn lessons from history. Not because there's often the phrase history doesn't repeat, it echoes.
Yeah, I just wanted to let's hear from an Auschwitz survivor, Renee Salt, who's speaking at events from Auschwitz itself.
I get very